if you don't think there's still the concept around the debtor's prison, you may think it's a thing of the past. Well, you'd be wrong. The practice of imprisoning people who owe money to the state or in private enterprise was outlawed in 1833, and the Supreme Court reiterated this in a number of rulings in the 20th century. Now, they say that it's unconstitutional to jail people for fines who are unable to pay their debt, but more than a third of the states allow borrowers to be jailed either because they can't pay it, they can't afford to pay it. This latest instance, the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio just released this report saying that the state still has debtor prisons. In Huron County, Ohio, for instance, in the second half of 2012, more than 20% of all the bookings in their jails had to do with the failure to pay these fines. Now, to discuss this further, RT producer Rachel Curzius joins me now. Hi there, Rachel.
Hi, Margaret.
So Ohio is illegally jailing debtors. What's happening?
Yeah, the Ohio ACLU came out with a pretty bleak report called The Outskirts of Hope, and it paints a picture that shows that essentially 1 in 5, as you said, prisoners in Huron County are essentially there because they continue to owe money on a debt, whether it's a public debt, for instance, court fines, or whether it's a private debt that they owe, for instance, something like a furniture payment or some other form of private debt. In 1.5 months in summer 2012, so from mid-July through the end of August, they found that 45 defendants in Parma Municipal Court were there because they weren't paying their debts, and 75 people at the Sandusky Municipal Court. So we see that this is actually a relatively routine practice. This isn't one where you can say, oh, here's one aberration, but this isn't going on a lot.
So you're telling me that there are certainly people can, I'm assuming legally at this point, be jailed for not paying fines or other debts in certain states, essentially.
Well, legally is an interesting question, right? So technically it's illegal, and the reason is, first of all, as you mentioned in your introduction, it was made illegal in 1833. This was reiterated by the Supreme Court in 1970, again in 1971, where they said, listen, the 14th Amendment for Equal Protection essentially extends to make sure that people who are impoverished, people who can't pay these fines, and that's the key here, right, is that people who aren't able to pay these fines shouldn't be jailed for their inability to do so, because otherwise the law is more punitive against the impoverished people. So it's not equal protection.
Okay, so what are the certain legal implications for jailing somebody over debt?
Well, essentially, it's illegal. So in Ohio, for instance, it's both against federal law, that 1833 federal law, and then the state constitution also has a clause that says that debt prisons are not legal, and furthermore, that in order to determine whether someone could be jailed, say, for not paying a fine, you first need to have a hearing to figure out whether they're actually capable of paying that fine. So you essentially have them go into court and have a look through their finances and say, oh, look, you actually have this nest egg, so the fact that you're not paying the furniture company, the fact that you're not paying, say, this ticket for keeping your dog off of a leash, you could be paying that. What they're finding is, in a huge percentage of these cases, no one is having that hearing in the first place. So these people are put in prison.
Okay, so do we think that these people have legal representation? Is that the problem?
Well, that is the problem. What they found was that 80% of the people who are jailed are eligible for public defenders, meaning that, first of all, they're impoverished, so they don't have any meaningful way to pay these fines and debts that are levied against them. And when they do have legal representation, they don't have those hearings themselves. So, you know, you could have a lawyer, but if you don't have a hearing for which the lawyer to speak, you're in trouble. Now, certainly in terms of people reaching out to them, the ACLU is a legal defense fund. And it seems like this is something that's very much on their radar. And in their report, though, they showed a lot of people who essentially were in prison for many months at times, and ended up, the cost of arresting and imprisoning these people was much higher than the debt that they owed. So the question here is, let's say states like Ohio, for instance, do have budgetary problems. This doesn't seem to be a meaningful way for them to fix these problems, because they're essentially paying more money to imprison than they would, say, by using a civil case to get this money.
Certainly seems like it. So aren't these courts breaking federal laws by jailing these people? I guess that's the bottom line.
Right. It certainly seems that way. They're breaking federal law. In the case of Ohio, they're also breaking their state law, as well as countering a lot of Supreme Court cases that have come out relatively recently.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for joining me. That was RT producer Rachel Curzius in studio.